Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to, depending on wherever you may live, or however you choose to look at your clock this early morning, middle of the night bonus. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads that I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump into this early morning or middle of the night bonus upload, shall we? I'm going to break this up into two parts. The first part is subscriber Reptilian, very strange kind of goings on in Louisiana and elsewhere. And then the second part is really how deep the one world government, the 1%, whatever you want to call them, the alien agenda, how deep these hands really go and how far worldwide they go. Why would America, why would the United States hand over a federal funded entity to the UN? It makes no sense, and you will see exactly what I'm talking about in a few seconds here. Let's get into it.
2019, Saints vs. Denver Superdome Sports Arena, New Orleans, Louisiana. My second encounter. Hello, Jeff. I hope you're good. I'm a little nervous about this one. This was a massive public event, and I'm not sure how a story like this will be accepted or not. I don't know if this will be bad for the general public and make them afraid to go to games. I don't want any repercussions at all from this. I don't want any backlash from the Saints or the Superdome, but it really happened, and I want you to know about it. Like I said, I'm a terrible liar. I don't make things up because I can't remember lies, so I only tell the truth. It's so much easier. So if you should want to make the location vague in your description, then be my guest. I don't want any flack in this encounter. Please don't mention my name at all. It's another completely true incident you may find interesting and might want to share with your listeners. It was a very brief encounter, but I do have an intense photographic memory at certain times, especially for odd encounters of any type. I haven't spoken to anybody about this. This is the first time I'm typing it out from memory. It was a bright sunny day with no clouds in the sky. My friend who works locally in the area where I live got some tickets offered to her to go to the Saints game in the Superdome in New Orleans. Some season ticket holder seats that the owner of the tickets wouldn't be using that game. She called me and asked if I'd like to attend, and I said sure, because I seldom went to games at all, mostly just watched them on TV. I thought it'd be fun. I don't think I'd ever attended a game before at the Superdome since living in Louisiana, but when she initially told me about the tickets and asked me to go, I pretty much instantly got a vague sense of dread. A sense I couldn't really pinpoint at all. Just knew that it was there. It was odd because I was very much aware of it, but couldn't understand it at all. It was vague and definite at the same time. So finally on game day, we both drove together in my car. I drove us there. We parked across the street from the huge Superdome in the high-rise parking deck area. then walked down the stairs and entered the main check-in point. It was a fairly light security area, no metal detectors. We showed our tickets to get in the main entry checkpoint at Champion Square, which is a large open-air court a few hundred feet wide. It was packed with hundreds and hundreds of people walking in every direction, crisscrossing paths all the time with each other. There was a really good band playing on the stage at the low level of the square to the right of us when we walked into Champion Square. They were pretty much in the shade under the large awning, and the sun was behind us. There was a large crowd of people standing still before them to watch and listen to them play. They were great and very versatile in the songs they played. It was a large band as well. It was a beautiful, bright, sunny day with clear blue sky, low humidity, and only a slight breeze. It was a perfect day, temperatures in the low 80s. We listened to the band for about 20 minutes, and then we heard a really awesome primal-sounding drum band coming from the top of a long concrete stair behind us. So we walked upstairs to see them play as well. When we got up there, we could see that there were at least 20 drummers in a semicircle arrangement. Their drums were huge, it was loud, and I loved it. They were great, loud, and in sync, and really fun to listen to. These guys were good. They kept up the rhythm and the tempo the entire time they played. There was a fairly large, static crowd around them, watching them, as we were as well. We watched them for a while, maybe 15 minutes, until they took a break from playing as well. It was still too early to get into our seats before the game started. We decided to walk back down the stairs again to the lower level just to kill some time. But the larger band had still not started back up yet. The huge crowd was still milling around, many people with beer cups in their hands. I noticed earlier that because the drummers were at the much higher level than the band below them was, that they actually didn't interfere with each other's acoustics when we heard them both playing at the same time before. When we got to the bottom of the stairs, we started navigating through the busy masses of people walking in every which way. It was an interesting crowd with all types of people. We were checking out the wild-looking saint's face makeup and various pseudo-warpath adornments for the game. Some ladies had colorful feather umbrellas. We were having a great time there, just crowd watching and walking. When we got to the bottom of the stairs, my friend was walking out in front of me by several steps as we were zigzagging. I was trying to catch up to her, while trying not to bump into anybody. Then, as we walked only about 15 feet out from the very bottom of the staircases and into the crowd, I noticed something coming from my left field of vision. I think I felt them before I saw them. It was weird, like the quick answer to my feeling of vague dread I noticed and felt when she first asked me to go with her. That feeling abruptly vanished and was replaced with something else. There were two tall men approaching my direction from the left side fairly rapidly. It appeared to me that my friend also noticed them as well, because I saw her as she turned to her left, and she looked directly at them, as I was doing at the same time, but she turned her head forwards and continued walking anyway. These tall guys were about 20 feet to our left at a particular moment. They got my attention because right away I noticed they moved at a slightly faster pace than the rest of the crowd was actually moving. As they moved toward me, approaching from the immediate left, I could see them, and they were both the exact same height, about 6'3". My first impression was, oh, how clever, they're dressed up as vampires, I thought to myself. But the impression quickly vanished as they continued to get closer to me, because it was becoming quite clear as they moved closer that they were not in costume, but something much more grotesque, something much more odd, really odd. They were both wearing small-brimmed black caps on top of both their heads, and black long-sleeved, unwrinkled shirts. Their shirts were not tucked in, but outside over their pants, so I couldn't see any belts or loops. The shirts were tailored and buttoned up down in the middle. The cuffs were buttoned up as well. They wore long black pants, like black jeans, but faded somewhat. They had on black leathery shoes, worn out looking. The buttons on their shirts were of clear plastic but slightly yellowish color, as if they were old. They were buttoned all the way up to their necks, completely buttoned from the top to bottom. They also had on very dark black sunglasses, to where their eyes were not visible at all behind the lenses. I couldn't see any hair at all on the sides of their faces, or their hands at all. They were both very tall and thin, with the exact same build, and looked like twins, pretty much like identical twins. But their faces is what really took me by surprise. They both had the same exact dark black sunglasses with heavy black plastic frames all around them. I noticed as they approached me that their facial skin was a shiny grayish white with an underlining hue of faint but apparent blue to it. Kind of shiny looking, like their skin was made out of glossy wax or a gel-like substance. Their necks looked the same color, and so did their hands, which were both down at their exact sides as they walked. They had nothing in their hands as they walked, and their hands were not clenched, but somewhat relaxed looking. Their nails were as white as their skin color. Their hand shape looked unremarkably exact for a waxy white-blue color, what was very similar, if not identical, to their facial color. They exactly appeared to have 3 or 4 layers of skin colors. The outer layer of their skin looked glossy, clear, shiny, and waxy. The second and next layer looked pure, very bright white. The pure light blue at the third layer, which was more apparent in the shading at prominent angles on their faces, such as their cheeks, below their chins, and near their ears. There was a sheen of gray color inside the layers of skin as well, but I couldn't determine where it appeared with certainty, but it was evident somewhat. As they rapidly approached me, I literally had to stop quickly in my tracks, because otherwise I would have collided with them both. They both acted like they didn't even notice me, or anyone else in this huge crowd at all. They never moved their heads, but seemed to be looking just straight ahead. They both walked directly in front of me, as I stopped just short from them, only a few inches away. They were close enough to where I could have just put my hand forward a little, and could have easily touched one of them as they passed me by. These strange alien-skinned looking twins also walked very strangely, with pronounced odd, very forward-leaning synchronized gait. They also were walking in a complete unison, step after step after step. And I noticed they also didn't have any hair on the back of their necks either. Their skin color on the back of their necks looked exactly like the skin on their faces. They both seemed absolutely mentally laser-focused on moving straight ahead with no impediments, despite the very large crowd. I didn't see them stop or zigzag like everyone else was forced to do. They were moving in a pretty straight line through the massive crowd, which was another really odd observation that I made, because no one else was doing that, just them. I have never seen such odd-looking whatever they were before, so I continued to stare at them as they passed before me. I knew I was looking at some kind of unusual and abnormal something I had never seen in my entire life up to this point. They passed so close to me, I had to look up at their faces and heads. My brain was in total record mode at the complete oddness. There was no doubt about it that it was no costume they were in. They were not human. They might have been trying to look human, but they weren't. My senses were on the highest alert from this strange sighting from that moment I detected them from my left side. I also noticed a slight musty smell coming from their clothes as they passed directly in front of me, less than a foot away. But I noticed no body heat as they passed in front of me, none at all. And no human smells of sweat, cologne, shampoo, underarm deodorant, detergent, nothing. I can always smell people and what they have on, but these two, nothing. Then the most incredible thing happened to me, because at that very moment as they passed inches from me, I experienced an instantaneous swerve and sudden abrupt pain reflex in my entire abdomen as they were the closest to me, passing right before me, extreme, intense, but brief. It was such a pronounced, sharp reflex that it caught me in mid-breath and actually stopped my breath at the same time. It was a quick, hideous, and completely involuntary physical reaction to something I've never experienced before either. Not a gasp, but an instant halt of my breath at the intense pain that I felt. It was quick, powerful, but it wasn't nauseous. It was worse. This was something I've never felt before. It came and went, fleeting and fast. They moved quickly past me and kept going. They kept on going and continued through the crowd towards my right field of view. I stood transfixed on them, watching them continue on. They were much taller than most of the people around them. They stunned me with their oddness. People or humans normally walk with a bouncing gait or a side-to-side motion as they take each step, but these two walked in unison with no sway, no bounce, no nothing. Their head position stayed level and completely smooth and very even as they walked. They moved forward and were taking definite steps, but almost seemed to be gliding along. Another oddity that I noticed that their arms and hands stayed even, still, immobile at their sides. Their arms did not move back and forth as they walked on, as most people do, in order to maintain balance. That was another obvious clue to me that they were not human by any manner. I also quickly looked down and noticed their shoes, which were apparently somewhat worn leather, light black shoes, faded out somewhat in color, as if they were old. They looked like slip-on shoes because there were no shoelaces or anything on top. The leather was smooth but worn-looking. I noticed that much unlike the well-worn human shoes, the creases of their shoes were not near the toes at all, like they should have been if they were human, but their creases on their shoes instead were much higher up and closer to their ankles by only a few inches, maybe just a mere inch and a half. The creases were made by the bending of the tops of their shoes, and were high enough to almost touch the bottom edges of their long pants. I couldn't see any ankles because the pants were long, almost touching the leather shoes. I didn't notice any socks, and couldn't see any skin as well. I realized how bizarre that was because I never noticed that type of odd upper creasing before on anyone's shoes. It was not normal. It was like they didn't have any toes at all, but a completely different kind of foot. This would have explained the odd gait they were walking forward. I stayed still and observed them as they continued onward toward where we had to come in and had to show our tickets in order to gain entry. Another bizarre oddity was that hardly anyone in this huge crowd of people seemed to pay them any attention at all or notice how strange they really were. Because they were taller than most people, they seemed somewhat inconspicuous as they moved through the huge crowd. Most people were somewhat shorter, so they would have been looking at the middle of their shirts and not their faces higher up. They too seemed oblivious to the crowd as well. They just seemed laser-focused on getting out, on leaving the crowded area. I wondered how they got inside the area in the first place. I detected no emotion at all coming from either of them. They seemed almost robotic in action and manner. As they passed me and got about another 25 feet towards my right, I did notice one woman almost bumping into them, as I almost did. When she looked up at them, I saw her snap her head backwards in a shocked manner as she noticed their faces. She was wearing a white shirt and a black skirt and carrying some type of clothing over her left arm as she stopped. That was the only person I noticed in the huge crowd who reacted to their presence. To me, that was not very comforting thought because I don't lie and make things up to validate my sightings of these two odd creatures. If there was any security video at all, that was recording on that day at Champion Square, these two things should be evident on that recording, and from many angles as well. I didn't mention it to security there at the time or anyone else because it was so bizarre. I didn't know how they got in the area to begin with. Security by the main access point that we came in through to present our tickets would have noticed them. They were leaving, and that was obvious. The game wouldn't be starting for at least another 15 minutes. The whole encounter as they approached me, then passed so closely in front of me, and then continued on, lasted only about 25 to 30 seconds, if that, maybe less. They walked at a brisk, even pace. They looked like they were not about to be stopped by anyone or anything. I could clearly see that they were heading straight towards the exit, because the size of the crowd before me and blocked my view of them after that. I didn't actually see them exit the area. I just knew they were headed out there. That was obvious. After I couldn't see them anymore, I continued walking and zigzagging to catch up to my friend, who was now about 30 feet in front of me. And when I got next to her, I instantly exclaimed, "Did you see those two odd-looking guys with the black outfits and the white skin?" She laughed and said they must be vampires, and she just kept walking along, totally unconcerned by it. I felt a little mild shock, to say the least, but what I had witnessed, after all, it was not every day that you see something as strange as that. They weren't acting, they weren't smiling, their faces looked like waxy pretense of a human being, and a very bad smile of one at that. Without any further notice of seeing them again, we later made it to our seats and watched the entire game. I kept scanning the specter crowd to see if they were still present, but didn't notice them in the huge arena, which was a difficult task anyway, without any binoculars. We drove back without incident after the game and didn't discuss them at all. We stopped for dinner at a nice restaurant to avoid the traffic that was headed back, but they were always in the back of my mind during our conversations. I felt uneasy in the particular mood after seeing them. It bothered me in a vague, uncomfortable way. I didn't want to bring them up to her at the dinner table because it was so disgusting to have witnessed them. I certainly didn't want to bring them up, that sickening instant reaction I had to them being so close to me as well, which was so weird and impossible to deny that it happened. I felt oddly violated in a very hard-to-explain way. Paranormal stuff is so hard to explain because it's so rare and unusual, and just not part of our everyday vocabulary. How to describe what I never saw before in my life? Due to the fact that I clearly saw them, it also leads me to wonder if there was any type of odd or hidden crime at the Superdome that had occurred on that same day and was never publicized. Was a body found somewhere in the stadium and not announced? Did someone go missing and was never published in the newspaper? I wish I knew more answers to this odd encounter, like details, like information. I don't like living in the dark and not knowing anything, especially when something like these two appear and go almost completely unnoticed in such a massive, crowded arena. Are people really that blind to what's going on around them? That's even more scary than seeing those things glide by. And, by the way, I don't care to ever see or witness anything like those two things again. It was not fun. It wasn't pleasant. And it definitely wasn't in our plans for the day. My eyes always tell me the truth. Thank you. Now, really quick before I get into the final part of the upload, I wanted to share this with you guys. I have a really good friend of mine, and he's super, super intelligent, book smart, street smart, and he's really not into the cryptid phenomenon. He is and he isn't. He's kind of like sitting on the cusp of it, I guess. But I bounce ideas and theories off of him because he just has some interesting views on things. And so I shared this with him, and he goes, wow. He goes, that's crazy. And he goes, I don't think it was a vampire. I don't think they were vampires though, bro. And I'm like, yeah, I don't either for some reason. And he said, do you have an idea of what you think they were? And I said, I do. I said, how about on the count of 3, we just kind of blurted out. And we did, and we both said reptilian. And I went back and I reread it, and I kind of really had my mind into that reptilian kind of, and I stopped midway through it, and I was like, this is truly, like, this is a reptilian encounter. I mean, the sickness feeling, the hue in their skin, to me, that's what it felt like. I wasn't there, so I really didn't get to witness, but the way the person described them, just in how they moved, is, you know, I mean, it's just, I don't know. I think this was a reptilian encounter, and if I was a betting man, that's what I would bet on, to be honest with you. And now, if you go back and listen or think about, what I'm saying, and then kind of think about the encounter, and see what you get. Because I really 100% feel like it's a reptilian. It's creepy as hell, man. It is creepy as hell. Anyway, moving on. Today's final encounter. This experience was told to me by one of my firearm instructors named Chris. In northern Idaho, deep in the Rocky Mountains, there's a cabin that runs a cattle ranch. Chris's brother knew the owner and invited Chris to spend the weekend up there for some hunting and hiking. The brothers gathered their supplies and a few of their best pals and took off into the mountains. As they were driving up the windy Idaho road, the brother issued a cryptic warning. Sometimes the cattle escapes into the woods and needs to be tracked down. The owner of the ranch has seen strange creatures in the forest, and I'm not messing around. Everyone laughed and didn't take the warning seriously. Within an hour, they arrived at the cabin. On the second day in the mountains, Chris decided to go for an afternoon hunt with one of his friends. They drove down the back road into the forest until the road ended a few miles from the cabin. They got out and walked to a nearby creek, then split off with one person going upstream and one person going downstream. After walking for a ways, Chris came to a silty deposit where he noticed a foul odor and a broken pine tree that was green and healthy. The trunk was snapped in the direction of the water. There were 4 finger indentations in the tree bark, like it was squeezed and pulled down by a massive hand. Sap bubbled from the compressed bark. On the ground, he discovered numerous large footprints with 5 toes stamped into the silt. He followed them and counted 73 beautiful tracks that led to another snapped green pine tree. This tree also had a big finger marks on it, and was facing in the direction of the water. Tracks danced all around the tree. The smell was overwhelming. Chris became spooked, and he immediately ran back to the truck. His friend had shot a deer, and they quickly drove back to the cabin with it. At the cabin, Chris explained the situation to everyone. That night, 6 men from the cabin armed themselves, each with a rifle and pistol, and returned by truck to the end of the dirt road. They parked the truck facing the creek and then walked on foot to the edge of the water. It was a moonless, starry night, but the horrible smell still lingered. The band of hunters waited and at one point howled in the night, calling for the creature. Chris thought he could hear something moving in the forest, but the creek was too loud to be sure. He decided to walk alone upstream into the woods to get a clearer sound. He could hear that there was definitely something big making its way through the pines. He ran back to the hunters and warned them that something was approaching. Moments later, from both up and downstream, they began hearing branches snapping and footsteps thudding. The sounds came from both directions, closing in on the group. The footsteps grew louder and louder until booming crunch of a log under the surface of the mud spooked them so much they ran back to the truck. In less than 2 minutes, they made their way back to the vehicle. The moment they fired up the truck and turned on the headlights, they could see two massive bipedal creatures moving up the creek in the location they had just retreated from. The creatures' eyes shined from the truck's headlights. All of the men had clear shots, but they took flight back to the cabin in terror. The stench greeted them upon their return. They feared that with the slain deer outside, the creatures would be drawn to the property. They all slept curled up with their guns that night, but no more signs of the creatures would be found. I told you, little brother, I wasn't screwing around. He figures he ran into a family of them. There was a wild look in his eyes as he turned to me and said, I know they exist.
And this is part 2 of the early morning, middle of the night. And this is what I was talking about. Why and how does this even happen? Wait to the very end. It's just like, who really is running the show and making these decisions?
The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. They've been authorized for the past 40-plus years by presidential executive orders to confiscate all property from the American peoples, separate families in the current 43 internment camps, already built and operational, by the way, 5 of which are located in Georgia. The largest can confine somewhere on the order of 100,000 American citizens, called relocation camps by the government, for assignment to work camps, declares martial law, and totally overrides the United States Constitution. Presidential executive orders that are relayed or control this are given at the end of this. 2 of the state prisons here in Georgia are currently empty, although manned by a minimal number of staff, have been set up and intentionally unpopulated by prisoners just to support this political policy. Concentration or internment camps, an executive order signed by President Bush in 1989, authorized the Federal Emergency Management Agency to build 43 primary camps having the capacity of 35,000 to 45,000 prisoners each, and also authorized hundreds of secondary facilities. It is interesting to note that several of these facilities can accommodate 100,000 prisoners. These facilities have been completed, and many are already manned, but as yet contain no prisoners. Remember all the talk of overcrowded prisons that exist. In South Georgia, there are several state prisons that, except for a few guards, are completely devoid of prisoners. Under FEMA, the executive orders, which are already written and is the current law of the land, calls for the complete suspension of the United States Constitution, all rights and liberties as they are currently known. The following executive orders, which are in the Federal Register located in Washington, D.C. for anyone to request copies of, call for the suspension of all civil rights and liberties, and for extraordinary measures to be taken, as most of the orders state, any national security emergency situation that may confront the government. When FEMA is implemented, the following executive orders will be immediately enforced. EO 12148, FEMA National Security Emergency, such as national disaster, social unrest, insurrection, or national financial crisis. EO 10995 provides for all seizure of all communications media in the United States. EO 10997 provides for the seizure of all electric power, petroleum, gas, fuels, and minerals, both public and private. EO 10998 provides for the seizure of all food supplies and resources, public and private, and all farms, lands, and equipment. EO 10999 provides for the seizure of all means of transportation, including personal cars, trucks, or vehicles of any kind, and total control over all highways, seaports, and waterways. EO 11000 provides for the seizure of all American people for workforces under federal supervision, including splitting up families if the government has to. EO 11001 provides for the government seizure of all health, education, and welfare functions. EO 11002 designates the Postmaster General to operate a national registration of all persons. Under this order, you would report to your local post office to be separated and assigned to a new area. Here is where families would be separated. EO 11003 provides for the government to take over all airports and aircraft, commercial, public, and private. EO 11004 provides for the Housing and Finance Authority to relocate communities, designate areas to be abandoned, and establish new locations for population. EO 11005 provides for the government to take over railways, inland waterways, and public storage facilities. EO 11051, the Office of Emergency Planning, has complete authorization to put the above orders into effect in time of increased international tension or economic or financial crisis. All of the above executive orders were combined by President Nixon into Executive Order 11490, which allows all of this to take place if a national emergency is declared by the President. The burning and insurrection of L.A., in the case of the Rodney King, could have executed and partially did execute these executive orders. Executive Order 12919, National Defense Industrial Resource Preparedness, signed by Clinton, June 3, 1994, delegates authorities, responsibilities, and allocations of FEMA's executive orders for the confiscation of all property from the American people and their relocation and assignment to labor camps. The executive order also supersedes or revokes 11 previous executive orders from 1939 through 91 and amends Executive Order 10789 and 11790. This executive order is a declaration of war against the American people by the secret government of the United States in concert with the United Nations. Operation Dragnet. Attorney General can implement this operation upon receiving one call from the President. Arrest warrants will be issued via computer to round up over 1 million patriot Americans who may resist the New World Order. Americans who will not politically correct, specifically mentioned, are Christians or those who read the Bible. Concentration internment camps have already been built to accommodate these American prisoners. See above paragraph, as these internment camps have been set up and are run by FEMA. Note, in reference to Christians, just where should they or we stand in regards to defending America? Should Christians take up arms if necessary? Apparently, the founding fathers of the American Republic believed so long as it was in order to defend their country, their women and children, and not in order to engage in an offensive warfare for the sake of conquering and exploiting others, which, to me, would be living by the sword, or, you could say, making a living by the sword. This could be exemplified by the Germans, who initiated unprovoked invasions of their neighbors to meet their economic needs during World War I and II. One might ask, what about the Orthodox Jews and the Greek Orthodox Christians who went to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter without resisting during World War II? Why didn't they fight more zealously to defend themselves? That's a hard question, and one that we don't have an answer for. It may have simply come down to the lack of unity of faith and understanding of threat. All we can say is that from a study of the Old and New Testaments, there is no passage that forbids us from defending ourselves from aggressors, at least in the national sense. However, we are forbidden to become the unprovoked aggressors ourselves, or engage in conflicts, which are offensive rather than defensive oriented. The offensive attacks against the Native Americans, for instance, resulting from the Anglo invasion of North America, cannot be justified through Scripture, and such policies and mistreatment of the Native Americans, the continuous betrayal of treaties, and the stealing of their God-given land in the past have or will doubtless have an adverse effect on Americans. Unless reparations are made to the native peoples, for instance, a restoration of historic territories. Perhaps the Greys felt justified in repeatedly violating our government's secret treaties with them because we had done the same exact thing to the Native Americans. Perhaps we, in part, deserved the abuse that the Greys have inflicted upon us. Perhaps our nation's destiny will be largely determined by how we treat the Native Americans from here on out, whether or not we begin to honor all of the treaties that we had made or broken in the past. Could it be? On the other hand, if offensive warfare is forbidden by God, then defensive warfare against the foreign invasion of American soil or an internal threat to our freedoms as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights would, from perspective, be justified. In Psalms 125:3, we read how the rule of the wicked is the direct violation of the will of God. For the wicked shall not rule the godly, lest the godly be forced to do wrong. A perfect example would be the Lutherans of Germany, who, all too often, catapulted to the Nazis, who themselves were backed by the Luciferian cults, which the Christians should have resisted. Instead, many of these backslidden Christians in Germany grudgingly supported the atrocities of their Nazi leaders, and by default, the extermination of millions of Jews, Gypsies, Slavic men, women, and children. Why could Martin Luther himself stand alone against hundreds of pompous religious hypocrites at the Council of Worms in Germany and boldly accuse them of blasphemy to their faces? Yet many of his Protestant followers, not detracting from those few brave souls who did resist, give in right and left to the Nazi Satanists, and in some cases even contributed to the atrocities of World War I and II. So in short, if a situation exists wherein an offender or a defender must die, one or the other, so that the other could live, then the defender would be the one who should keep his or her life. In warfare, the invader should be considered the murderer for killing a human being, whereas if the invaded took the life of the invader, it should be considered execution in retribution for the murderous acts of the invaders themselves. All of this would be justified in the name of and according to the rules of the society, which gives the defending citizens the power to defend his or her country, just as one is authorized to use deadly force against an unwelcome intruder into their home if they feel their lives are being threatened. The only exception to this would be an offensive invasion of an allied country which has been invaded by an enemy force, or selective invasion of an enemy country in order to rescue allied citizens who are being held within a targeted region. as in underground bases, for instance, in which case the invasion should be considered a form of self-defense on behalf of their own citizens, so long as the invader remains in a mode of offensive defense. Operation Thunder. The Attorney General states this operation, which comprises of county-wide sweeps of house-to-house, dynamic entry, search and seizures for all guns and food stockpiles by BATF, State National Guard, active duty soldiers, as well as local police. This function is also run and coordinated through FEMA. Public Law 100/690 banned almost all religious gatherings, grants no-knock seizures, no-knock search and seizures without a search warrant, expands the drug laws to include every American. This will generally be a prelude or in addition to a FEMA operation and contingency plan implementation. The Omnibus Crime Bill of 1990 ensures confiscation of all private property via money laundering, environmental violations of the Clean Water and Air Act, and extends as far as child abuse. This act also coordinates activities through FEMA and the Department of the Army, Commanding General, U.S. Forces Command, Fort McPherson, Georgia, which is the executive and implementing agency upon initiation of these acts. The responsible agency with the U.S. Army Force Command was what used to be known as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations Plans Divisions, which has changed several years ago to J-3 after the headquarters became a joint headquarters. They keep on file copies of all FEMA emergency management operation plans, including those plans developed by the Army to support the FEMA plan to eliminate the U.S. Constitution upon implementation. According to current plans, the Constitution will be temporarily discontinued and shelved until real or perceived and declared threat has been neutralized. But once shelved, as with almost every other action of the government, it stays shelved. The Crime Bill of 94. Banning of all military weapons, which is necessary for the formation of a militia, denies other military equipment to the People's Militia units. Prelude to confiscating all guns in the hands of private citizens, destroys the First Amendment, and makes virtually every American an outlaw. See above concerning the house-to-house search. The agency responsible for the actual implementation and search is the Department of the Army, in concert with local and state police, including FEMA, FBI, BATF, and other federal agencies. Secret underground bases. There have been documented over 60 secret virtual cities underground, built by the government, Federal Reserve Bank owners, such as the Rockefellers, and high-ranking members of the Committee of 300. Some of these underground areas can be seen in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. In addition, there exist underground satellite tracking facilities which have the ability to punch your 911 address into the computer, and satellite can within seconds bring a camera to bear on your property to the point that those monitoring can read a license plate number on your automobile in your driveway. These facilities have, as of October 1st, 94, been turned over to the foreign power of the United Nations.
All right, folks. One of the reasons why I talked a little bit about the FEMA thing is because, you hear about these huge FEMA encampments that are being built. I know there's one up in Alaska, and you think about what happens if, what if, and is that when the 1% and the alien agenda make their appearance? Is that when humanity, becomes enslaved like they want. I really truly hope not. But if they're building these encampments and they have an idea, they definitely do, and it is evil. It is very evil. It is not godly. It is not even close to being. It is Satan at its best, I'd have to say. Anyway, thank you all for supporting the channel. Your support is what keeps this channel growing and going, and honestly, what gives us all a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free. Just simply treated with the respect we deserve. Please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, our pets, our family, and friends. These creatures are real. These events are real. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless.